I was standing in my driveway at 5:30 in the morning, watching my breath turn to fog in the freezing Minnesota air, when I realized that the woman marching toward me in a pink bathrobe and duck boots meant nothing but trouble. My name is Henry Atkins, and I had been running a snow removal business in Lakewood Springs, Minnesota for the past 7 years. It was honest work, hard work, and during the brutal winters we got out here, it was necessary work. I had 14 commercial clients, including the local grocery store, 2 strip malls, and a medical clinic, plus about 40 residential customers who trusted me to keep their driveways and walkways clear. I took pride in being reliable, showing up before dawn when the snow fell overnight, making sure people could get to work and emergency vehicles could access homes. But apparently, someone had a problem with that. The woman stomping through the fresh powder toward me was Brenda Whitmore, president of the Lakewood Springs Homeowners Association. I had moved into this neighborhood 2 years ago, drawn by the reasonable property prices and the fact that my warehouse facility was only 10 minutes away. The HOA had seemed manageable at first, just some basic rules about lawn care and exterior paint colors. I should have known better. Mr. Atkins, Brenda's voice cut through the quiet morning like a chainsaw. We need to talk about your little operation here. I set down the ice scraper I had been using on my truck's windshield. Good morning, Brenda. What can I help you with? She pulled her bathrobe tighter, her face pinched with irritation. You can help me by explaining why your truck starts rumbling down the street at ungodly hours, waking up the entire neighborhood. Do you have any idea what time it is? I glanced at my watch, though I knew exactly what time it was. 5:30. I have to get to my clients before businesses open and before people leave for work. Snow removal is time sensitive. That's what I'm here to discuss. She produced a folded piece of paper from her bathrobe pocket, somehow keeping it crisp despite the falling snow. The HOA board held an emergency meeting yesterday, and we've decided that your business activities violate our community noise ordinances. You're disturbing the peace. I felt my jaw tighten. Disturbing the peace. Brenda, I'm running a legitimate business. My truck isn't any louder than anyone else's vehicle, and I'm not operating power equipment at this hour. I'm just driving out of my driveway. Your diesel truck is extremely loud and you're often loading and unloading equipment. We've had complaints. She thrust the paper toward me. This is an official notice from the HOA board. You're prohibited from operating any business-related vehicles or equipment before 8 a.m. or after 6 p.m. on weekdays, and not at all on weekends. I took the paper, scanning it quickly in the dim light from my porch. It was exactly as she had described, printed on official HOA letterhead with the signatures of all 5 board members. This is ridiculous. 8 a.m. By that time, my clients will already be trying to open their businesses or will have already left for work. This effectively shuts down my business. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before choosing to run a business out of a residential neighborhood, Brenda said primly. The HOA covenants clearly state that residents must maintain neighborhood quality of life. Your industrial activities don't belong here. Industrial activities. I park my truck in my driveway same as everyone else. I store my equipment in my garage. Everything else happens at my warehouse or at client locations. And yet you're loading and leaving at all hours, creating noise pollution. The decision is final, Mr. Atkins. If you violate these restrictions, the HOA will be forced to take legal action. We can fine you up to $500 per day per violation. Before I could respond, she turned on her heel and marched back toward her house 3 doors down. I stood there in the growing daylight, snow accumulating on my shoulders, staring at the paper in my hand. This couldn't be legal. It just couldn't. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, Mike Patterson, leaving a voicemail explaining the situation. Then I got in my truck and headed out to service my clients, because regardless of what the HOA wanted, people were counting on me. Mrs. Chen at the medical clinic needed her parking lot clear for patients. The grocery store needed safe access for early morning deliveries. I wasn't going to let them down. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. I continued my normal schedule, leaving around 5:30 each morning when winter storms rolled through. On the third day, I found a bright orange violation notice stuck to my front door. $500 fine for operating in violation of HOA rules. The next day, another notice. Then another. I finally connected with Mike Patterson on the phone that Friday afternoon. He had reviewed the HOA covenants and the notice they'd given me. "Henry, I've got to be honest with you," Mike said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "The HOA covenants are problematic. There is a section about maintaining neighborhood tranquility and limiting commercial activities, but the restrictions they're trying to impose are likely unenforceable. They can't effectively prevent you from running a legitimate business that's primarily operated off-site. You're not running a body shop out of your garage or storing hazardous materials. You're parking a truck. So what do I do about these fines they keep slapping me with? Don't pay them. Not yet. First, we're going to send them a formal response disputing the fines and their authority to impose these restrictions. Then we're going to file for an injunction in county court." "An injunction?" "Yes. We're going to ask the court to prevent the HOA from interfering with your legitimate business operations. We'll argue that their restrictions are unreasonable, overreaching, and potentially in violation of your property rights. Minnesota law is actually fairly favorable on this. HOAs have authority, but it's not unlimited." That made me feel slightly better, but only slightly. "How long will this take?" "Could be a few weeks to get a hearing. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. If anyone from the HOA confronts you, film it if possible. Keep records of all your business activities. Show that you're being reasonable and responsible." I followed Mike's advice. I installed a camera on my porch that captured my driveway and the street. I kept a detailed log of my departure and arrival times. I even went around to my immediate neighbors, the ones whose houses were closest to mine, and asked if my truck was actually bothering them. Tom Morrison, who lived directly next door, looked confused by the question. "Your truck, Henry? I barely notice it. My alarm goes off at 6 anyway. And honestly, I'm grateful someone's out there clearing the roads early. Last week when we got that surprise snowfall, you had the street done before I even had to leave for work." The Johnsons on the other side said essentially the same thing. The more people I talked to, the more I realized that Brenda had likely drummed up this entire campaign herself, maybe with one or two allies on the HOA board. Most people didn't care, but Brenda certainly cared. She cared enough to be standing in her front window watching me every single morning. She cared enough to take photographs of my truck, and she cared enough to escalate the situation beyond anything I had anticipated. On a Tuesday morning in late January, I walked out to my truck at 5:15 to find all 4 of my tires slashed. Clean cuts, clearly deliberate. I stood there staring at the damage, anger and disbelief washing over me in waves. My security camera had been spray painted over sometime during the night. I called the police. Officer Dave Santos arrived about 20 minutes later, taking photos and a statement. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked. "I have a pretty good idea," I said, explaining the ongoing dispute with the HOA. "But I can't prove it was Brenda Whitmore or anyone she knows. My camera was disabled." We'll file a report. Check with your neighbors. See if anyone else has security footage that might have caught something. In the meantime, you might want to park elsewhere if possible. I called my clients and explained I would be late that morning, then arranged for a towing company to come replace my tires. The whole ordeal cost me $600 and most of the day. I was furious. Mike Patterson was furious too when I told him. This changes things. We're going to amend our filing. This isn't just about unreasonable restrictions anymore. We're dealing with harassment and intimidation, possibly criminal activity. But we can't prove Brenda did it. Not yet. But patterns matter. Document everything. The hearing for the injunction was scheduled for the first week of February in Hennepin County District Court. Mike filed all our paperwork, including my business records, neighbor statements, photographs of the tire slashing, and copies of all the violation notices and fines the HOA had issued. The total was up to $4,000 at that point. The Friday before the hearing, I had another encounter with Brenda. I was checking my mail around 3 in the afternoon when she pulled up in her white Lexus SUV, parking at an angle that blocked my mailbox. "Mr. Atkins, I hope you're not planning on going through with this ridiculous lawsuit," she said through her open window. "It's not a lawsuit, Brenda. I'm asking the court to recognize my right to run my business without harassment." "Harassment?" Her voice went up an octave. "We're enforcing community standards. If you don't like it, you can move. This neighborhood was peaceful before you brought your industrial operation here. I run a snow removal service, not a steel mill, and most of the neighbors have told me they have no problem with my truck." Of course they did. They're too polite to tell you the truth. She shifted her SUV into park and got out, moving closer. "But I'll tell you the truth, Mr. Atkins. You don't belong here. We don't want commercial vehicles and business activities in our neighborhood. It lowers property values and destroys the character we've worked hard to build." "Then you should take that up with the court on Monday," I said evenly, "because I'm not going anywhere and I'm not stopping my business." Her expression turned cold. "We'll see about that." She got back in her SUV and drove off. I immediately went inside and made notes about the encounter, including the implied threat. My attorney had told me to document everything, and I was going to do exactly that. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. I put on the only suit I owned, a navy blue number I had bought for my cousin's wedding 3 years ago, and met Mike at the courthouse at 8:30. The building was one of those imposing stone structures that made you feel the weight of the legal system just by walking through the doors. We found our courtroom and took our seats at the plaintiff's table. The HOA was represented by Gregory Walsh, an attorney from a firm that specialized in real estate and HOA law. He had silver hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than my truck payment. Brenda sat behind him in the gallery, along with 2 other HOA board members I recognized, Patricia Lambert and Robert Chen. Judge Margaret Steinberg presided. She was a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that was immediately apparent. After handling some preliminary matters, she addressed our case. "I've reviewed the filings from both parties," Judge Steinberg said. "Mr. Patterson, you're asking this court to issue an injunction preventing the Lakewood Springs Homeowners Association from enforcing certain restrictions against your client. Please present your argument." Mike stood, and I was impressed by how confident and prepared he seemed. "Thank you, Your Honor. My client, Henry Atkins, owns a legitimate snow removal business that he's operated for 7 years. 2 years ago, he purchased a home in the Lakewood Springs development, a deed-restricted community governed by a homeowners association. Mr. Atkins operates his business professionally and responsibly. He stores his vehicle in his driveway, just as other residents do. He stores his equipment in his garage. The actual work of his business occurs entirely off-site, at commercial and residential locations throughout the region. Mike pulled out several documents, providing copies to the judge and opposing counsel. However, the HOA has recently decided to target Mr. Atkins with unreasonable and restrictive rules that would effectively force him out of business. They've prohibited him from operating any business vehicle or equipment before 8 a.m. or after 6 p.m. on weekdays, and not at all on weekends. Your Honor, snow removal is a time-sensitive business. Snow falls at all hours. Clients need service before they open for business or before they leave for work. These restrictions make it impossible for Mr. Atkins to serve his clients. Your Honor, if I may, Walsh interrupted, standing. You'll have your turn, Mr. Walsh, Judge Steinberg said. Continue, Mr. Patterson. The HOA claims these restrictions are necessary to maintain neighborhood tranquility and quality of life. However, we've submitted statements from Mr. Atkins's immediate neighbors, none of whom have complained about noise or disturbance. In fact, they've expressed appreciation for his work. The only person who appears to have a problem is Miss Whitmore, the HOA president, who has engaged in an escalating campaign of harassment against my client. Mike laid out the timeline, the initial notice, the accumulating fines, the slashed tires, the confrontations. He presented the security camera footage showing my regular, reasonable schedule. He showed my business records demonstrating that I was a responsible operator with good standing in the community. Your Honor, HOAs have legitimate authority to enforce reasonable restrictions that protect property values and community standards. But they cannot use that authority to target individual homeowners with unreasonable demands that effectively deprive them of their property rights and their livelihood. We're asking this court to issue an injunction preventing the HOA from interfering with Mr. Atkins's normal business operations and to void the fines they've improperly assessed. Judge Steinberg nodded, making notes. Mr. Walsh, your response. Walsh stood smoothly, projecting an air of calm authority. Your Honor, this case is quite simple. The Lakewood Springs HOA has covenants that all residents, including Mr. Atkins, agreed to when they purchased property in the development. These covenants include provisions about maintaining neighborhood character and limiting disruptive activities. Mr. Atkins chose to purchase a home in a deed-restricted community. He doesn't get to ignore those restrictions simply because they are inconvenient for his business. The restrictions the HOA is enforcing aren't unreasonable, Walsh continued. 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. on weekdays represents normal business hours. If Mr. Atkins cannot operate his business within those parameters, then perhaps he should relocate his business operations to a commercial or industrial area, which is where they belong. Your Honor, residential neighborhoods have the right to maintain their character. Allowing commercial vehicles and equipment, allowing business operations at all hours, sets a precedent that would effectively transform a quiet residential community into a commercial zone. Today, it's a snow plow truck at 5 a.m. Tomorrow, it could be a landscaping operation with wood chippers, or a construction business with heavy equipment. The HOA has a duty to prevent that deterioration. I felt my blood pressure rising as Walsh spoke. He was making it sound like I was running some kind of industrial complex out of my garage, like I was the bad guy for trying to make a living. As for the alleged harassment, Walsh said, his tone dismissive, there's no evidence that anyone from the HOA had anything to do with the vandalism to Mr. Atkins's vehicle. That's an unfortunate incident, but it's not relevant to this case. And Miss Whitmore, as HOA president, has every right to communicate with residents about HOA matters. That's not harassment. That's her performing her duties. Judge Steinberg listened to both sides, asked several pointed questions about the specific language in the HOA covenants, and then announced she would take a short recess to review the materials more carefully. During the break, I sat with Mike in the hallway. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think we have a strong case, but it's hard to predict. Judge Steinberg is thorough. That's good for us. She's not going to just rubber stamp the HOA's position." 20 minutes later, we were called back into the courtroom. Judge Steinberg had a document in front of her, and her expression was serious. "I've carefully reviewed the HOA covenants, the restrictions the HOA is attempting to enforce, and the arguments from both parties," she began. "Let me address several issues. First, HOAs do have legitimate authority to enforce reasonable restrictions. However, that authority is not unlimited. Minnesota law requires that HOA restrictions be reasonable and that they be enforced fairly and uniformly." She looked directly at Walsh. "Mr. Walsh, I've reviewed the Lakewood Springs covenants. The sections you're relying on are quite general, talking about maintaining neighborhood character and limiting disruptive activities. Nowhere do these covenants specifically prohibit residents from operating businesses or from parking commercial vehicles. The restrictions your client is attempting to enforce appear to be newly created rules specifically targeting Mr. Atkins." Walsh started to object, but Judge Steinberg held up a hand. "I'm not finished. Second, even if the HOA had the authority to create such restrictions, the specific restrictions at issue here are unreasonable. Mr. Atkins operates a seasonal business that requires early morning and potentially late evening work. His business is primarily conducted off-site. The evidence shows that his activities cause minimal disturbance to the neighborhood, and that his immediate neighbors have no complaints." I felt hope rising in my chest. "Third," Judge Steinberg continued, "the pattern of escalating fines and the confrontational approach taken by the HOA president suggests that this is not a good faith effort to enforce community standards, but rather a targeted campaign against a specific individual. That's not what HOA authority is for." She picked up her pen and signed the document in front of her. "I am therefore granting the plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction. The Lakewood Springs Homeowners Association is hereby enjoined from interfering with Mr. Atkins's normal and reasonable business operations, including his use of his personal vehicle to conduct his snow removal business. The HOA is further prohibited from assessing any fines or penalties related to these activities." Relief flooded through me. Mike reached over and gripped my shoulder. "However," Judge Steinberg added, "Mr. Atkins, you have responsibilities as well. You will maintain reasonable hours and noise levels. You will not store excessive equipment or materials in view of the neighborhood. You will not expand your operations in a way that creates a legitimate nuisance. And you will continue to be a good neighbor." "Yes, Your Honor. Absolutely," I said. "As for the fines already assessed, they are void and the HOA will not attempt to collect them. If either party believes the other is violating the terms of this injunction, you will file a motion with this court. Do both parties understand?" We both acknowledged that we understood. Judge Steinberg gavelled the hearing closed. As we walked out of the courtroom, I saw Brenda's face, red with anger and humiliation. She whispered furiously to Walsh, who was gathering his materials with a tight expression. Patricia Lambert and Robert Chen looked uncomfortable, probably realizing they had backed the wrong horse in this dispute. Outside the courthouse, Mike shook my hand. "Congratulations, Henry. That went about as well as we could have hoped. Thank you, I mean it. I don't know what I would have done without your help. Just doing my job. Now, remember what the judge said. You've won the right to operate your business, but you need to be a model neighbor from here on out. Don't give them any ammunition. I won't. I just want to do my work and live in peace. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The injunction was a huge relief, but I knew the situation with Brenda and the HOA wasn't really over. She didn't seem like the type to accept defeat gracefully. I was right to be concerned. Over the next few weeks, things got weird. Brenda stopped acknowledging me when we crossed paths, which was fine by me. But I started noticing other things. My garbage can would be knocked over on collection day. A package that was supposed to be delivered disappeared from my porch. Small, petty things that were hard to prove, but created a constant low-level aggravation. I documented everything, just as Mike had taught me. I upgraded my security cameras and made sure they were tamper-resistant. I kept my yard immaculate, my truck clean, my snow removal operations as quiet and efficient as possible. I wasn't going to give Brenda or the HOA any legitimate complaints. February turned into March, and a major blizzard hit the Twin Cities area on the second weekend of the month. It was one of those storms that dumps 2 feet of snow in 30 hours, the kind that makes national news and shuts down highways. For a snow removal operator, it was all hands on deck. I worked around the clock that weekend, clearing my clients' properties, helping with emergency access routes, even volunteering to help the county clear some of the side streets in town. I finally got home Sunday evening, exhausted and hungry, looking forward to a hot shower and about 12 hours of sleep. My driveway was blocked. Someone had piled snow across the entrance, a wall of packed snow and ice about 4 feet high, extending the full width of my driveway. It would take me at least an hour to clear it with a shovel, and my snow plow was on my truck, which I couldn't get into the driveway to access my garage where my tools were stored. I sat in my truck, staring at the obstruction, feeling exhaustion and anger warring for dominance. This was deliberate. This was someone sending a message. I pulled out my phone and took photos and video from multiple angles, making sure to capture the surrounding area and the fact that no other driveways on the street were blocked. Then, I called the non-emergency police line and filed a report. An officer came by an hour later, took his own photos, and told me the same thing Officer Santos had said weeks earlier about the slashed tires. Without evidence pointing to a specific person, there wasn't much they could do. I ended up parking on the street and spending 2 hours clearing my driveway by hand in the dark. By the time I got inside, it was past 10 p.m., and I was beyond exhausted. The next morning, I sent all the photos and documentation to Mike Patterson. He called me back within an hour. "Henry, this is getting out of hand. I think we need to file a motion to hold the HOA in contempt of the injunction. This is clearly harassment designed to interfere with your business. But we can't prove it was Brenda or the HOA board. We don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. This is civil court. We just need to show that it's more likely than not that the harassment is coming from them, and that it's violating the spirit of the injunction. Judge Steinberg was clear that they couldn't interfere with your operations. Having your driveway deliberately blocked after a major snow event certainly qualifies." Mike filed the motion that afternoon. A hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, but in the meantime, Mike requested an emergency meeting with the HOA board's attorney, Gregory Walsh. The meeting took place at Walsh's office, a sleek downtown space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Mississippi River. Brenda showed up with Walsh, along with 2 other board members, Patricia Lambert and a man named Stephen Torres, who I had seen at HOA meetings but never spoken to. Mike got straight to the point. My client has been subjected to ongoing harassment and intimidation since the court issued the injunction. We have documented instances of vandalism, theft, and now deliberate obstruction of his property. This needs to stop. Brenda's face flushed. We haven't done anything to your client. We followed the court's order to the letter. Have you? Mike pulled out a folder thick with documentation. Let's talk about patterns. Every incident of harassment or vandalism has occurred after Mr. Atkins had an interaction with you, Miss Whitmore. His tires were slashed the day after you confronted him about the lawsuit. His driveway was blocked the weekend after the injunction was issued. Packages disappeared after he received certified mail from the HOA about an unrelated issue. Either you have the worst luck in the world or someone is targeting him. Walsh held up a hand. Mike, accusations without proof don't help anyone. My clients deny any involvement in these incidents. If someone in the neighborhood has a grudge against Mr. Atkins, that's a police matter, not an HOA matter. It becomes an HOA matter when the HOA president is the common denominator in all these incidents, Mike shot back. And it becomes a court matter when these actions violate an explicit injunction. The meeting went in circles for another 30 minutes. Brenda denied everything. Walsh defended his clients, and Mike made it clear we weren't backing down. Finally, Walsh suggested a cooling-off period. Look, emotions are running high. Let's all take a step back. The HOA will make a good-faith effort to ensure Mr. Atkins is not subjected to any harassment from HOA board members or at HOA events. Mr. Atkins will continue to operate his business responsibly. And everyone will stop antagonizing each other. Can we agree to that? Mike looked at me. I nodded. Fine. But if anything else happens, we're going straight to the judge. We left the meeting with nothing really resolved, but at least it was on record that we had tried to work things out. The hearing 2 weeks later was brief. Judge Steinberg reviewed the new evidence, warned both parties about the consequences of violating her orders, and reinforced the injunction. She stopped short of holding anyone in contempt, but her warning was clear. Any further interference would result in serious penalties. March turned into April, and the snow finally stopped. My busy season wound down, and I shifted into my off-season mode, which mostly involved equipment maintenance and planning for the next winter. The harassment from Brenda seemed to have stopped, possibly because Walsh had made it clear to her that continuing would have legal consequences the HOA couldn't afford. I thought maybe things were finally settling down. I was wrong. In late April, I received a notice that the HOA was holding a special meeting to vote on amendments to the community covenants. The proposed amendments included specific restrictions on commercial vehicles, business equipment, and business-related activities. If they passed, they would effectively resurrect all the restrictions Judge Steinberg had ruled against. I called Mike immediately. Can they do this? The court already said those restrictions were unreasonable. They can propose amendments, yes. HOA covenants can be changed if enough homeowners vote for the changes. Usually it requires a supermajority, like 2/3 or 3/4 of residents. But Henry, this could be a problem. If they get these amendments passed, we're back to square one, except this time the restrictions would be explicitly written into the covenants. So what do? You fight it politically. Go to the meeting, speak out, talk to your neighbors. Make sure people understand what's really going on here. The special meeting was held on a Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse. I showed up early and was dismayed to see that Brenda had stacked the deck. She had printed slick information packets about maintaining neighborhood character and property values. She had prepared a PowerPoint presentation with photos of commercial vehicles and equipment in other neighborhoods, making it look like industrial blight. About 60 residents showed up, which was a good turnout for the neighborhood. Brenda opened the meeting with her presentation, painting a picture of a neighborhood under siege from commercial activities that would destroy property values and quality of life. "We're not talking about preventing people from working," she said smoothly. "We're talking about maintaining the residential character that we all invested in when we bought our homes. Commercial vehicles and business operations belong in commercial zones, not in our driveways and garages." Several residents nodded along. I felt my chances slipping away. Then Tom Morrison, my next-door neighbor, stood up. "Brenda, can I ask a question?" "Of course, Tom. This is about Henry Atkins and his snow plow truck, isn't it? I mean, let's be honest about what we're really voting on here." Brenda's smile tightened. "This is about establishing clear standards for the entire community." "Right, but Henry's the only person who's had any issues with the HOA about this, and I live right next door to him. His truck doesn't bother me at all. In fact, he plowed my driveway for free 3 times this winter when I was having back problems. He's a good neighbor." A woman I didn't recognize spoke up. "I agree. Henry cleared my sidewalk after that big February storm when I was sick with the flu. I didn't even ask him to, he just did it." "Why are we trying to run him out of the neighborhood?" More people started speaking up, sharing their own experiences. The Johnsons talked about how I had helped them when their son's car got stuck in the snow. A couple from around the corner mentioned that I always waved and said hello. An elderly man named Frank Peters stood up and said, "I've lived here for 20 years, and I've never had a problem with Henry or his truck. But I'll tell you what I do have a problem with. I have a problem with the HOA board trying to bully someone out of the neighborhood because one person has a grudge." The meeting turned into a referendum on Brenda's leadership, rather than on the proposed amendments. People started asking pointed questions about how much the HOA had spent on legal fees fighting me, money that came from their dues. They asked why the board had pursued this issue so aggressively when there were potholes in the neighborhood streets that needed fixing and playground equipment at the park that needed updating. Brenda tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was too late. When the vote was finally called, the amendments failed spectacularly. Only about 15 people voted in favor, nowhere near the 2/3 majority required. I left that meeting feeling vindicated. My neighbors had stood up for me. They had seen through Brenda's campaign and rejected it. It felt like a turning point. The next day, I wrote personal thank you notes to Tom Morrison, the Johnsons, and several other neighbors who had spoken up on my behalf. I wanted them to know how much their support meant to me. Spring turned into summer, and life in the neighborhood settled into a peaceful routine. Brenda was noticeably absent from community events. I heard through the grapevine that several residents had called for her resignation, though she hadn't stepped down. The other board members started making decisions without her, and the HOA seemed to function better for it. I used the summer to expand my business, adding 3 new commercial clients and upgrading some of my equipment. I also spent time fixing up my house, painting the trim, updating the landscaping, making sure my property looked its best. I wanted there to be no doubt that I was invested in the neighborhood and took pride in my home. In August, something unexpected happened. Patricia Lambert, one of the HOA board members who had initially sided with Brenda, came to my door. "Henry, do you have a minute?" she asked, looking uncomfortable. "Sure, Patricia, come on in." We sat in my living room and she got right to the point. "I owe you an apology. I should never have gone along with Brenda's campaign against you. I didn't really think it through. She made it sound like you were causing all these problems, and I just accepted what she said without investigating for myself. I appreciate that, Patricia. What changed your mind? A lot of things. Talking to other neighbors, seeing how you handled yourself at the special meeting, but honestly, the final straw was finding out what Brenda did. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? Patricia took a deep breath. Do you remember when your tires were slashed back in January? My heart started pounding. Yes, it was Brenda. She confessed to me last week. She was drunk at a neighborhood barbecue and it just came spilling out. She said she did it to teach you a lesson, to show you that you couldn't defy the HOA. She also admitted to blocking your driveway after the February snowstorm. She used her son's truck to pile the snow there. I felt anger and vindication in equal measure. Did she say this in front of other people? Yes. There were 4 of us there. We were all shocked. I told her she needed to come clean and apologize to you, and she just laughed. She said you couldn't prove anything and it didn't matter anyway. Patricia, I need you to give a statement to the police. This isn't just about the HOA anymore. This is criminal vandalism. Those slashed tires cost me $600 and a day of lost income. She nodded. I know. That's why I'm here. I'll give a statement. Stephen Torres will too. We've already talked about it. What Brenda did was wrong and she needs to face consequences. I called Officer Santos, the police officer who had taken the initial report about the slashed tires. When I explained that I had witnesses who could testify that Brenda had confessed to the vandalism, he told me to come down to the station with Patricia and Stephen. We went that afternoon. Patricia and Stephen both gave detailed statements about what Brenda had said at the barbecue. They also provided contact information for the other witnesses who had been present. Officer Santos took everything down carefully and told me he would follow up with the prosecutor's office. 2 weeks later, Brenda Whitmore was charged with criminal damage to property. It was a misdemeanor, but it was on the record. She was also facing potential civil liability for the cost of the tires and my lost income. Mike Patterson helped me file a small claims lawsuit against Brenda personally, separate from the HOA, seeking damages for the vandalism and the harassment. We asked for $3,000, covering the tires, lost business income, and the cost of the upgraded security system I had installed. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Brenda initially pleaded not guilty, but when faced with multiple witnesses and her own recorded statements, she changed her plea. In October, she appeared before a judge and pleaded guilty to criminal damage to property. She was sentenced to probation, community service, and ordered to pay restitution for the cost of my tires. The judge also gave her a stern lecture about abusing her position as HOA president and engaging in harassment. Miss Whitmore, HOAs exist to benefit the community, not to serve as personal fiefdoms for board members to pursue vendettas. Your behavior has been disgraceful. You're fortunate this is being handled as a misdemeanor and not as part of a larger harassment or stalking case. Brenda resigned from the HOA board the same week. Patricia Lambert was elected as the new president, and one of the first things she did was issue a formal apology to me on behalf of the HOA. She also worked with the board to reimburse the legal fees I had incurred defending myself, using funds from the HOA's reserve account. The small claims case was settled out of court. Brenda agreed to pay me $2,000, and in exchange, I agreed not to pursue any further civil action against her. Mike advised me to take the settlement. You've won, Henry. You've been vindicated. You've recovered your costs, and the person who caused all these problems is facing real consequences. Don't drag it out longer than necessary. By the time November rolled around and the first snow of the season fell, everything felt different. I drove out of my driveway at 5:30 in the morning, just like I had always done, but this time I didn't have to worry about violation notices or confrontations. The injunction was still in place. Brenda was gone from the HOA board, and my neighbors knew the truth about what had happened. My business thrived that winter. I added 6 more clients, hired a part-time helper to handle the increased workload, and even started bidding on some larger commercial contracts. The story of my legal battle with the HOA had gotten around, and several business owners told me they respected how I had stood up for myself. In January, almost exactly a year after Brenda had first confronted me in my driveway, the HOA held its annual meeting. Patricia Lambert presented the year's financial reports and discussed plans for the upcoming year. At the end of the meeting, she publicly thanked me for my patience and professionalism throughout the difficulties of the previous year. Henry Atkins demonstrated what it means to be a good neighbor even when facing unfair treatment, Patricia said. He continued to help people in the neighborhood, he followed the rules, and he stood up for his rights without being aggressive or vindictive. He's an example for all of us. The room erupted in applause. I felt my face turn red with embarrassment, but I also felt proud. I had fought for what was right, and I had won. After the meeting, Tom Morrison came over with a beer. "Henry, I've been meaning to ask you something. My son's starting a landscaping business. He's worried about where to live because he needs to park his trailer and equipment somewhere. I told him about what you went through. Do you have any advice?" I thought about it for a moment. "Tell him to read the HOA covenants carefully before he buys. Make sure he understands what restrictions exist, and if he does run into problems, tell him to document everything and get a good lawyer early. Don't wait until things escalate." "That's good advice. You know, what happened to you changed this neighborhood for the better. People are more aware now. They pay attention to what the HOA board is doing. They ask questions. It's healthier." He was right. The entire situation, as difficult as it had been, had made the community stronger. People were more engaged. The HOA board was more transparent and responsive. And there was a better understanding of the balance between community standards and individual rights. I continued running my snow removal business from my home in Lakewood Springs for years after that. I never had another problem with the HOA. I worked hard, treated my neighbors with respect, and built a successful business that served the community. Looking back, I'm grateful for how things turned out, even though the fight was exhausting and stressful. I learned a lot about standing up for myself, about the importance of documentation and legal advice, and about the power of community support. I also learned that HOAs, like any organization, are only as good as the people who run them. When those people abuse their authority, it's up to the community to hold them accountable. The injunction that Judge Steinberg granted me remained in effect as long as I owned the property. It served as a legal shield against any future attempts to restrict my business operations. But more than that, it served as a reminder that rights matter, that individuals can stand up to organizational power, and that courts exist to protect people from unreasonable and arbitrary rules. I eventually sold my house in Lakewood Springs years later, when I decided to relocate to a larger property that could accommodate my expanding business. By then, my company had grown to include 6 full-time employees and dozens of commercial and residential clients throughout the metro area. The kid, who Tom Morrison's son, was by then one of my subcontractors, having built his own successful landscaping business. When I put my house on the market, it sold in 3 days for above asking price. The real estate agent told me that the neighborhood's reputation had actually improved over the years, partly because the HOA had become known as reasonable and well managed under Patricia Lambert's leadership. At the closing, the couple who bought my house asked me about the HOA. "We heard there was some kind of legal issue a few years ago," the husband said. "There was," I acknowledged, "but it got resolved. The HOA board is solid now. They're fair, they're transparent, and they respect homeowners' rights. You'll be happy here." And I meant it. The neighborhood that had once felt hostile had become home. The people who had stood by me had become friends. The system that had initially seemed stacked against me had ultimately worked the way it was supposed to, protecting my rights and holding wrongdoers accountable. The last time I drove down the street in Lakewood Springs, headed away from the house I had fought so hard to keep, I felt a sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth it. I had proven that one person, armed with determination, good legal advice, and community support, could stand up to an overreaching HOA and win. And somewhere in Minnesota, probably in another neighborhood, another homeowner was probably facing a similar battle. I hoped they would have the same support, the same resources, and the same positive outcome that I had. Because everyone deserves to live in peace, to run a legitimate business, and to be treated fairly by the organizations that govern their communities. That's the real purpose of HOAs, and that's the real power of the legal system. To balance individual rights with community standards, to prevent abuse of authority, and to ensure that everyone plays by fair and reasonable rules. When those principles are upheld, everybody wins.